The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the weathered Mercantile in St. Joseph, Missouri, and Margaret Vaughn pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching dust swirl around the wheels as her heart hammered against her ribs with the weight of everything she was running from. The year was 1873, and she had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia with nothing but 2 tattered carpetbags, a forged letter of recommendation, and a secret that could get her hanged if the law ever caught up with her. The advertisement she had answered 3 months ago had promised a respectable marriage to a cattle rancher named Henry Lancaster, a man she had never met but whose careful, measured words in his letters had given her hope that perhaps she could start over, that perhaps the blood on her hands could be washed clean by the Missouri River and forgotten in the vastness of the Western Territories. She stepped down from the coach, her dark blue traveling dress already coated with a fine layer of trail dust, and surveyed the main street of St. Joseph. The town bustled with activity even in the late afternoon heat. Wagons rolled past loaded with supplies, cowboys tied their horses to hitching posts outside the saloon, and women in calico dresses hurried along the wooden sidewalks with their shopping baskets. It was bigger than she had expected, more civilized, which both comforted and unnerved her. More people meant more questions, more chances for someone to recognize her face from the wanted posters that had been circulating back east. "Miss Vaughn." A deep voice drew her attention, and she turned to see a tall man standing a few feet away, hat in his hands. He was older than she had imagined from his letters, perhaps 30 years to her 22, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a striking gray blue, the color of storm clouds over the prairie, and they studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. This was Henry Lancaster, the man who had agreed to marry a complete stranger based on nothing more than her carefully crafted lies about being a seamstress from a good family fallen on hard times. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, extending her hand. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I am pleased to finally meet you in person." He took her hand carefully, as though she might break, and she noticed the calluses on his palms, the strength in his fingers. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Vaughn. I hope your journey was not too difficult." "It was long," she admitted, "but I am grateful to have arrived safely." He nodded, retrieving her bags from the coach driver and tipping the man generously. "My wagon is just down the street. The ranch is about 8 miles outside of town. I thought we might stop at the hotel first, let you rest and freshen up before we head out. The Reverend can marry us tomorrow morning if that suits you, or we can wait a few days if you need more time to get settled." Margaret's throat tightened. Tomorrow. She would become Margaret Lancaster tomorrow, would take this stranger's name and bind her life to his, all to escape the noose that waited for her back in Pennsylvania. "Tomorrow is fine," she said quietly. "There is no reason to delay." Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion she could not quite read. Relief, perhaps, or maybe disappointment that she seemed so eager to formalize their arrangement without taking time to know him first. But he simply nodded and gestured toward the wagon. "Then tomorrow it is." They walked side by side down the bustling street, and Margaret tried to ignore the curious glances from townspeople. News of the mail-order bride would spread quickly in a place like this, she knew. People would talk, would speculate, would wonder why a man like Henry Lancaster needed to send away for a wife when surely there were eligible women here who would have been happy to marry a prosperous rancher. The hotel was modest but clean, a 2-story building with a restaurant on the first floor. Henry secured her a room and carried her bags upstairs, setting them carefully inside the door. "I will be back at 7 to take you to supper, if that is agreeable," he said. The restaurant here is quite good, and I thought we might talk, get to know each other a bit before the wedding." "That would be nice," Margaret said, though her stomach twisted with anxiety. Talking meant questions, meant more lies she would have to remember and keep straight. But it was unavoidable. She had known when she answered his advertisement that she would have to be convincing, would have to become someone else entirely. After he left, she sank onto the bed and let out a long, shaky breath. The room was simple but comfortable, with lace curtains on the window and a wash basin in the corner. She stood and poured water from the pitcher, scrubbing her face and hands, watching the dust swirl in the basin. If only she could wash away her past as easily as the grime from the trail. Her mind drifted back to that terrible night 6 months ago, to the sound of glass breaking, and her stepfather's heavy footsteps on the stairs. He had been drinking again, had come to her room with that look in his eyes that made her skin crawl. She had warned him before to stay away, had begged her mother to believe her, but her mother had been too dependent on his money to listen. That night, when he had forced open her door, she had grabbed the letter opener from her writing desk without thinking. The struggle had been brief and violent, and when it was over, he lay dead on her bedroom floor with the silver blade buried in his chest. She had not meant to kill him, had only meant to defend herself. But who would believe that? He was a respected businessman, a pillar of the community, and she was just a girl with no proof of his abuse except her own word. So she had run, had taken what money she could find and fled into the night, eventually making her way west where she hoped the law would never think to look for her. A knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. Her heart raced until she heard Henry's voice. "Miss Vaughn, I know it is early, but I thought you might like to walk around town a bit, see the place before supper." She opened the door and found him standing there with a somewhat sheepish expression. "I realize I might seem overeager," he said, "but the truth is, I have been looking forward to your arrival for weeks, and sitting in the saloon waiting for 7 o'clock seemed like a poor use of time." Despite her fear and anxiety, Margaret found herself smiling. There was something endearing about his honesty, his lack of pretense. "A walk sounds lovely," she said, retrieving her bonnet from where she had set it on the dresser. They strolled down the main street as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Henry pointed out the various establishments: the general store, the blacksmith, the schoolhouse, the church where they would be married in the morning. He spoke easily, telling her about the town's history as a jumping-off point for wagon trains heading west on the Oregon Trail, how it had grown over the years into a prosperous trading center. "What made you decide to send for a mail-order bride?" Margaret asked as they paused near the riverfront, watching the Missouri flow past in lazy currents. "Surely there are women here who would have been interested in marrying you." Henry was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the water. "I was married before," he said finally. "Her name was Caroline. She died 4 years ago giving birth to our son. The baby died too." Margaret's hand moved instinctively to touch his arm. "I am so sorry. The women in town, they knew Caroline, they knew how much I loved her. Any of them I might have courted would have been living in her shadow, would have been compared to her memory every day. I thought it might be easier for both of us, a new wife and myself, if we started fresh. No comparisons, no expectations based on what came before." She understood that more than he could know, the desire to escape the past, to become someone new. "That makes sense," she said softly. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and she felt exposed under his gaze. "Your letters were kind," he said, "thoughtful. You wrote about books you had read, ideas you had about the world. Most of the responses I received to my advertisement were practical in nature. women listing their skills and qualifications like they were applying for employment. But you wrote like you were trying to know me, to understand what kind of man I was. That is why I chose you. Guilt twisted in her chest. She had been careful with those letters, had tried to present herself as educated and refined without giving away too many details that could later be proven false. I wanted to make sure we would suit each other, she managed to say. I think we will, Henry said, and there was a warmth in his voice that made her want to believe him, want to believe that maybe she could actually have the fresh start she was so desperately seeking. They returned to the hotel for supper, and over plates of roast beef and potatoes, they talked more. He asked about her journey west, and she kept her answers vague, focusing on the landscape and the other travelers rather than where she had come from. He told her about his ranch, about the cattle he raised and the horses he bred, about his ranch hands and the life he had built there. It can be lonely, he admitted. The ranch house is comfortable, but it is big for just one man. I hired a woman from town, Mrs. Chen, to come out 3 times a week to cook and clean, but the rest of the time it is just me and the men in the bunkhouse. I am hoping that will change now. I am hoping to have a real home again, not just a house. I will do my best to make it a home for you, Margaret promised, and she meant it. Whatever her reasons for being here, whatever lies she had told to get this far, she would be a good wife to him. It was the least she could do. That night, lying alone in the hotel bed, she stared at the ceiling and wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. Marrying under false pretenses, building a life on a foundation of lies. But what choice did she have? Going back meant certain death. At least here she had a chance at something resembling a future. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Margaret dressed in her best gown, a deep green silk she had managed to keep packed away during her journey. It was wrinkled from travel, but she did her best to smooth it out, to make herself presentable for her wedding day. She pinned her dark hair up carefully and studied her reflection in the small mirror. She looked pale, nervous, but that was to be expected for a bride, wasn't it? Henry met her in the hotel lobby wearing a clean suit and a somewhat awkward expression. You look beautiful, he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. Thank you. You look very handsome yourself. They walked to the church together. No ceremony or procession. Just 2 people about to bind their lives together with vows that would be, for her at least, as much about survival as love. The Reverend was a kindly older man who asked no probing questions, simply led them through the traditional words. Margaret repeated her vows in a steady voice, promising to love and honor this man she barely knew, and when Henry slipped a simple gold band on her finger, she felt the weight of it like a shackle and a lifeline all at once. You may kiss your bride, the Reverend said, and Henry leaned down to press his lips gently to hers. It was chaste and brief, but Margaret felt something flutter in her chest nonetheless. Perhaps this could work. Perhaps she could learn to care for this good man who had offered her sanctuary without even knowing it. They signed the marriage certificate, making it legal and binding, and then Henry helped her into the wagon for the ride out to the ranch. The countryside was beautiful, rolling hills covered in prairie grass that swayed in the breeze, and in the distance she could see cattle grazing peacefully. It was so different from Philadelphia, so open and wild and free. Maybe that was what she needed. Space to breathe, room to forget. The ranch house came into view as they crested a hill, and Margaret's first thought was that it was much larger than she had expected. 2 stories of sturdy timber construction with a wide porch wrapped around the front and side. There were outbuildings scattered around the property. A barn, a stable, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Chickens scratched in a pen near the house, and a pair of dogs came bounding out to greet them as the wagon rolled to a stop. "Welcome home," Henry said, helping her down from the wagon. The words should have felt comforting, but instead they made her chest tight with emotion. Home. She had not had a real home in so long. He showed her through the house, and she could see Caroline's touch everywhere even though it had been 4 years. The carefully arranged furniture, the curtains in the windows, the dishes in the kitchen. This had been another woman's domain, and now it was hers. The thought was both daunting and sad. "You can change anything you like," Henry said, as if reading her thoughts. "I know it still looks like her house. I have not had the heart to change much, but I want you to feel comfortable here, to make it yours." "It is lovely as it is," Margaret said diplomatically. "Perhaps just a few small touches here and there to make it feel more like ours." He smiled at that, seeming pleased with her answer. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Henry introduced her to the ranch hands, a diverse group of men that included 2 former slaves who had come west after the war, a Mexican vaquero named Eduardo who handled the horses, and several young cowboys eager to prove themselves. They were polite and respectful, tipping their hats and welcoming her to the ranch. Mrs. Chen arrived in the afternoon, a small, efficient Chinese woman who had emigrated to Missouri with her husband to work on the railroads. Her husband had died in an accident 5 years ago, and she had been supporting herself and her teenage son through cooking and cleaning for the wealthier families in the area. She showed Margaret around the kitchen, explaining where everything was kept and what Henry's preferences were for meals. "He is a good man," Mrs. Chen said as she kneaded dough for bread. "Fair and kind. You are lucky." "I know," Margaret said, and she did know. Whatever circumstances had brought her here, she recognized that Henry Lancaster was a decent man who deserved better than a wife with a murder charge hanging over her head. That evening, after a supper of stew and fresh bread, Henry showed Margaret to the bedroom upstairs. It was large and comfortable with a big 4-poster bed and windows that overlooked the prairie. "I know this marriage is not conventional," he said, standing awkwardly near the door. "I do not expect anything from you tonight or any night until you are ready. We can take time to know each other properly." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you for understanding." He nodded and left her alone, and she heard him moving down the hall to what must have been another bedroom. She undressed slowly, hanging up her wedding dress and changing into a nightgown, then climbed into the big bed alone. It felt strange to be married but sleeping apart, and yet she was grateful for Henry's consideration. She was not ready for that kind of intimacy, not when every part of her felt like a lie. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Margaret rose early to help Mrs. Chen with breakfast for the ranch hands, then spent her days learning the routine of the ranch. She collected eggs from the chickens, worked in the vegetable garden behind the house, and began to make small changes to the interior, adding touches that felt more like her own. Henry was patient and attentive, coming in for meals and spending evenings with her on the porch, talking about the ranch and asking about her day. They were like 2 strangers learning a careful dance, circling each other politely but maintaining distance. He never pushed for more than she was willing to give, never demanded the intimacy that was his right as her husband. For that, she was grateful, but she also felt the weight of guilt growing heavier each day. He deserved to know the truth about who he had married, what she had done, but how could she tell him without risking everything? 3 weeks after the wedding, a stranger rode up to the ranch house. Margaret was in the garden when she saw him, a lean man in a dark suit with a badge pinned to his chest. Her blood ran cold. A lawman. She forced herself to remain calm, to keep weeding the tomato plants as though nothing was wrong, but her hands shook so badly she had to press them into the soil to steady them. Henry came out of the barn to greet the man, and they spoke for several minutes. Margaret strained to hear what they were saying but could not make out the words. Finally, Henry nodded and gestured toward the house, and the two men began walking in her direction. She stood on trembling legs, brushing dirt from her apron. "Margaret, this is Deputy Marshal Frank Coleman from Kansas City," Henry said. "He is looking for information about some horse thieves that might have passed through the area. Deputy, this is my wife, Margaret Lancaster." The deputy tipped his hat. "Madam, I apologize for the intrusion. Just doing my rounds, asking questions. Have you or your husband seen any suspicious activity in the last few weeks? Groups of men moving horses at odd hours, anything like that?" Relief made her dizzy. "Horse thieves, not a fugitive murderess." "No, deputy, nothing like that." They spoke for a few more minutes before the deputy mounted his horse and rode off. Margaret realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to exhale slowly. Henry was watching her with a concerned expression. "You look pale. Are you feeling all right?" "Just the heat," she lied. "I should go inside and rest for a bit." "Good idea. I will check on you before supper." She hurried into the house and up to the bedroom, closing the door behind her and sinking onto the bed. That had been too close. She had thought herself safe this far west, had believed that enough distance and a new name would be enough. But seeing that badge, hearing the lawman's voice, it brought everything rushing back. The blood on her hands, the look of shock on her stepfather's face, the sound of her mother's screams when she had discovered the body. Margaret had left a note trying to explain what had happened, begging her mother to understand, but she had no way of knowing if her mother had believed her, or if she had simply reported her daughter to the police. Either way, she was wanted for murder, and if they ever found her, if anyone ever connected Margaret Lancaster to Margaret Vaughn of Philadelphia, it would all be over. That night at supper, Henry was quieter than usual. Margaret picked at her food, her appetite gone, waiting for him to say something about her reaction to the deputy. Finally, he set down his fork and looked at her directly. "You were frightened today when the deputy came." It was not a question. Margaret considered lying, dismissing it, but something in his steady gaze made her hesitate. "I was just startled. I have never much cared for lawmen." "Why is that?" She took a sip of water, buying time. "My stepfather was a constable back in Philadelphia. He was not a kind man." Seeing badges, hearing that voice of authority, it brings back unpleasant memories. It was close enough to the truth to feel less like a lie. Her stepfather had not been a constable, but he had been friends with many of them, had used those connections to intimidate her into silence for years. Henry nodded slowly, seeming to accept this explanation. "I am sorry you had that experience. Not all lawmen are cruel, but I know there are enough bad ones to make anyone wary. Thank you for understanding." He reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm around hers. "Whatever happened in your past, Margaret, whatever brought you here, you are safe now. This is your home. No one will hurt you here." His words were meant to comfort, but they only made the guilt worse. She squeezed his hand and managed a smile, but inside she was screaming. She was not safe. She would never be safe as long as the truth hung over her head like an axe waiting to fall. The summer days grew hotter, and Margaret threw herself into work around the ranch, trying to outrun her thoughts and fears. She learned to churn butter, to preserve vegetables, to mend clothes and harness horses. The physical labor was exhausting but satisfying, and slowly she began to feel more confident in her role as the rancher's wife. Henry continued to be patient and kind, but she noticed the way he looked at her sometimes, a longing in his eyes that made her heart ache. They were married but not truly together, sharing a house but not a life. She knew it could not continue like this indefinitely. knew that eventually he would expect more from her, would want the marriage they had both agreed to. One evening in late July, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Henry had brought out a bottle of wine, something special he had been saving, and they sipped it slowly as the cicadas sang in the grass. "I have been thinking," he said after a long, comfortable silence. "There is a dance in town next Saturday night, a social at the church. I thought it might be nice if we went. Let people see us together as a proper married couple. We have been keeping to ourselves too much." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse, to make an excuse. More people meant more chances for someone to recognize her, more questions she would have to dodge. But she looked at Henry's hopeful expression and could not bring herself to disappoint him. He was trying so hard to make this marriage work, and she owed him something in return. "That sounds lovely," she heard herself say. His smile was worth the spike of anxiety in her chest. "Good. We will make an evening of it. Dinner at the hotel first, then the dance." The week leading up to the social was busy. Mrs. Chen helped Margaret alter one of her nicer dresses to better fit the current fashion, and Henry made a trip into town to have his good suit cleaned and pressed. There was an air of anticipation around the ranch, as though everyone was pleased that the boss and his new wife were finally venturing out together. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a cooling breeze that promised relief from the heat. Margaret dressed carefully in a deep burgundy gown with cream lace at the collar and cuffs. She arranged her hair in an elaborate updo with curls framing her face, and when she came downstairs, she found Henry waiting in the parlor looking handsome and somewhat nervous in his dark suit. "You look stunning," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You look quite handsome yourself." The ride into St. Joseph was pleasant, and Margaret tried to relax and enjoy the scenery. Maybe tonight would be all right. Maybe she could allow herself to have one evening of normalcy, to pretend she was just a regular woman married to a good man, with no dark secrets weighing on her soul. They had dinner at the hotel restaurant, a leisurely meal of beef and potatoes with wine and apple pie for dessert. Henry told stories about the early days of the ranch, making her laugh with tales of stubborn cattle and wayward horses. She found herself genuinely enjoying his company, appreciating his dry sense of humor and the intelligence in his eyes. It was easy to forget for a little while why she was really here. The church hall was decorated with lanterns and wildflowers, and music spilled out into the night from a small group of musicians in the corner. People milled about in their finest clothes, talking and laughing, and when Henry and Margaret entered, several heads turned to look at them. Margaret felt exposed under their curious gazes but kept her chin high and her hand tucked into the crook of Henry's arm. "Henry Lancaster, is this your new bride?" An older woman in a purple dress sailed over to them, her eyes bright with curiosity. "We have been dying to meet her properly." Henry made introductions. The woman was Mrs. Sarah Brennan, wife of the town doctor and apparent social arbiter of St. Joseph. She peppered Margaret with questions about where she was from, how she was adjusting to life in Missouri, what she thought of the ranch. Margaret answered carefully, keeping her responses vague and pleasant, always steering the conversation away from specifics. Other townspeople came to meet her throughout the evening, and Margaret smiled until her face hurt, making small talk and accepting congratulations on her marriage. Through it all, Henry stayed close by her side, a steady presence that helped calm her nerves. When the musicians struck up a waltz, he offered his hand. "May I have this dance? I would be honored." He led her onto the dance floor and took her in his arms with a confidence that surprised her. For a rancher who spent his days working cattle, he was surprisingly graceful. They moved together easily, swirling among the other couples, and Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. This was nice. This felt real in a way nothing had since she had fled Philadelphia. "You are a good dancer," she said, tilting her head to look up at him. Caroline loved to dance. I made sure I learned properly so I would not embarrass her at events like this. There it was again, the ghost of his first wife hovering between them, but Margaret did not feel jealous or resentful. Instead, she felt sad for him, for the love he had lost. She was a lucky woman to have been loved by you. Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion she could not quite name. I hope someday you might feel the same way. Before she could respond, the music ended and another couple approached to claim Henry's attention. Margaret excused herself to get some punch, grateful for a moment to collect her thoughts. She was standing near the refreshment table when a woman's voice behind her made her blood freeze in her veins. "Margaret Vaughn. Margaret, is that you?" She turned slowly, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Standing before her was Lydia Patterson, a woman she had known in Philadelphia, the daughter of one of her stepfather's business associates. Lydia looked older than Margaret remembered, with lines around her eyes and a baby balanced on her hip, but it was unmistakably her. "I am sorry," Margaret said carefully. "You must have me confused with someone else. My name is Margaret Lancaster." Lydia frowned, studying her face. "You look just like Margaret Vaughn. It is uncanny. She disappeared several months ago and there was such a scandal. Her stepfather was found murdered in his home and she was nowhere to be found. The police think she killed him." Margaret fought to keep her expression neutral even as panic clawed at her throat. "How terrible! But as I said, I am not this person. I am from Ohio originally, and I only recently came to Missouri as a mail-order bride." "Of course, I must be mistaken," Lydia said, but her eyes were still suspicious, still searching Margaret's face for confirmation. "The resemblance is just so striking. Well, it was nice to meet you, Mrs. Lancaster." Margaret watched her walk away, her legs so weak she had to grip the table for support. This was it. Her worst fear realized. Someone had recognized her, had connected her to her past. It was only a matter of time before Lydia mentioned the resemblance to someone else, before the story spread and the law came looking. "Margaret." Henry appeared at her elbow, his brow furrowed with concern. "You are pale. What is wrong? I need some air. Please, can we step outside?" He guided her through the crowd and out a side door into the cool night air. Margaret gulped in deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. Henry's hands were on her shoulders, steadying her. "What happened? Did someone say something to upset you?" She looked up at him, this good man who had given her shelter and kindness, who deserved so much better than a wife with murder on her conscience. The lies felt too heavy to carry anymore. She was so tired of running, so tired of looking over her shoulder. "Henry, there is something I need to tell you, something about my past." His expression grew serious. "All right, I am listening." The words stuck in her throat. If she told him the truth, he would hate her, would turn her into the authorities, would send her back to Pennsylvania to hang. But if she did not tell him and someone else did, it would be even worse. At least this way she could make him understand why she had done what she had done. "My name is not really Margaret Vaughn, or it is, but I lied about where I was from and why I came here. I am from Philadelphia, and 6 months ago I killed my stepfather." The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other. "He attacked me in my bedroom. He had been abusing me for years, and that night I defended myself. I did not mean to kill him, but I did, and I ran because I knew no one would believe me. He was respected, and I was just a girl with no proof. So I came here, answered your advertisement, married you under false pretenses because I was desperate and scared and had nowhere else to go." She waited for him to recoil, to call for the deputy marshal to curse her for deceiving him. Instead, Henry was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on her shoulders. Finally, he said, "This stepfather of yours, did he hurt you?" "Yes, for years." "And that night when you killed him, were you defending yourself?" "Yes. He forced his way into my room. I had warned him before to stay away, but he would not listen. I grabbed the only weapon I could reach." Henry nodded slowly, processing this information. Then he said something that shocked her to her core. "The past stays buried. Our future starts now." Margaret stared at him. "What?" "I do not care what happened in Philadelphia. I do not care what name you used before or what you had to do to survive. You are my wife, Margaret Lancaster, and that is all that matters. If you defended yourself against a man who meant you harm, then you did what you had to do. I will not judge you for that, and I will not let anyone else hurt you because of it." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "How can you say that? How can you forgive me so easily? I lied to you. You did what you had to do to escape a terrible situation. I understand that." He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and sobbing with relief and exhaustion. "You are safe here, Margaret. No one will take you away. I promise you that." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the darkness while the music drifted out from the church hall. When Margaret finally pulled back, wiping at her tears, she felt lighter than she had in months. The secret that had been crushing her was finally out in the open, and instead of rejection, she had found acceptance. "What about the woman inside, the one who recognized me?" she asked. "We will deal with it if it becomes a problem, but people see what they want to see. If we maintain that you are from Ohio, if we do not give anyone reason to doubt your story, most folks will accept it. And if someone does make trouble, well, I have friends in this town. The sheriff is a good man who understands that justice is not always the same as the law." Margaret shook her head in wonder. "Why are you being so kind to me? Why are you not angry?" Henry cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Because I am falling in love with you, Margaret. I have been since the day you arrived, maybe even before that from your letters. I know this marriage started as a practical arrangement, but it has become something more, at least for me. I want a real life with you, a real partnership. And I want you to feel safe enough to be yourself with me, to not have to hide or pretend." More tears came, but these were different, born of relief and gratitude and something else she was afraid to name. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I did not think I could, did not think I deserved to, but I am." He kissed her then, a real kiss, deep and tender and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "Let us go home," Henry said. "We can make our excuses, say you are feeling unwell. We need to talk more, need to figure out how to move forward from here." They returned to the hall just long enough to say their goodbyes, and if anyone thought it odd that the rancher and his bride were leaving early, they were too polite to say so. The ride back to the ranch was quiet but comfortable, Margaret's hand clasped firmly in Henry's. Back at the house, they sat in the parlor and talked until the early hours of morning. Margaret told him everything, the whole ugly story of her stepfather's abuse, her mother's willful blindness, the terrible night that had ended in death. Henry listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she described the years of fear and helplessness. "I wish I could have protected you from that," he said when she finally fell silent. "No child should have to endure what you did. I am not a child anymore. I am a woman who made a choice to defend herself, and I would make the same choice again if I had to. Good. You should never regret saving your own life." He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "From this moment on, we face everything together. Your past is our secret to keep. If anyone asks questions, we present a united front. You are Margaret Lancaster, my beloved wife, and you came here from Ohio to marry me. That is our story, and we stick to it no matter what. What if they find out anyway? What if Lydia tells people and someone investigates? Then we will deal with it when it happens, but I will not let them take you. I promise you that, Margaret. Whatever I have to do, whatever it costs, I will keep you safe. She believed him. For the first time since that terrible night in Philadelphia, she felt like maybe she could stop running, could stop looking over her shoulder. Maybe she could actually build a life here, with this man who saw her at her worst and still chose to stand beside her. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Henry walked her upstairs to the bedroom. At the door, she turned to face him. "Will you stay with me? I do not want to be alone tonight." "Are you sure?" "I am sure. We are married and I love you. I want to be your wife in every sense of the word." He kissed her softly, reverently, and then followed her into the room, closing the door behind them. That night, their marriage was finally consummated, and it was gentle and sweet, and everything Margaret had not known she needed. Afterward, lying in Henry's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. The next few weeks were the happiest of Margaret's life. She and Henry grew closer each day, learning each other's habits and preferences, building the kind of partnership she had always dreamed of, but never thought she would have. They worked together around the ranch, ate their meals together, and spent their evenings on the porch talking about everything and nothing. At night, they shared the big bed, and Margaret discovered what it meant to be truly intimate with someone, to trust someone completely with her body and her heart. The incident at the dance with Lydia Patterson did not seem to have any immediate consequences. Margaret waited anxiously for questions or visits from lawmen, but none came. Either Lydia had dismissed the resemblance as coincidence, or she had mentioned it and no one had taken her seriously. Either way, Margaret began to relax slightly, to believe that maybe Henry was right, that the past could stay buried. In late September, Margaret woke feeling ill, her stomach churning. She barely made it to the wash basin before losing the contents of her stomach. Henry heard her and came rushing in, holding her hair back and rubbing her back until the worst had passed. "Should I fetch the doctor?" he asked, worry evident in his voice. "No, I do not think that is necessary. I feel better already." But the nausea continued for several more days, always worst in the morning, and Margaret began to suspect what might be causing it. Mrs. Chen confirmed her suspicions with a knowing smile. "You are with child, Mrs. Lancaster. Congratulations." Margaret pressed a hand to her still flat stomach, overwhelmed by a mixture of joy and fear. A baby. She was going to have a baby with Henry. It was wonderful and terrifying all at once. Another life depending on her, another person who could be hurt if her secret ever came to light. She told Henry that evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, he simply stared at her in shock. Then a slow smile spread across his face, wider than she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably could be heard in the bunkhouse. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around carefully before setting her down and pressing his hands to her belly. "A baby. We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. Happy does not begin to cover it. "Margaret, this is everything I have hoped for. A family, a real family again." His expression grew more serious. "I know you must be scared, given what happened before with Caroline, but I promise I will get you the best care. We will make sure everything goes smoothly." She had not even thought about the danger of childbirth, had been too focused on her other fears. But now that he mentioned it, she remembered what he had told her about his first wife, about how she and the baby had both died. "We will be careful," she promised. "I will do everything the doctor says." The pregnancy progressed normally through the fall and into winter. Margaret's belly grew round, and she had to let out her dresses to accommodate her changing shape. Henry was attentive and protective, sometimes overly so, worrying if she lifted anything heavier than a dinner plate or walked too far from the house. But his concern came from love, and she appreciated it even when it bordered on excessive. They passed a quiet Christmas at the ranch, just the two of them and Mrs. Chen, who cooked an elaborate feast. Henry gave Margaret a beautiful locket with their wedding photo inside, and she gave him a new pocket watch she had ordered from a catalog. They sat by the fire that night, Margaret's head on Henry's shoulder and his hand resting on her belly, feeling the baby kick and move. It was peaceful and perfect, and Margaret allowed herself to believe that this life was really hers to keep. January brought snow and bitter cold that kept everyone close to the house. Margaret spent her days sewing baby clothes and preparing the small room next to their bedroom as a nursery. Henry and Eduardo built a beautiful cradle from polished oak, and Mrs. Chen contributed quilts and blankets. Everyone on the ranch seemed excited about the coming baby, as though it represented hope and new beginnings for all of them. In early February, Margaret was resting in the parlor when she heard horses approaching. She looked out the window and felt her blood run cold. Deputy Marshal Coleman was back, and this time he had two other men with him. One wore a marshal's badge, and the other was dressed in an expensive suit that marked him as someone important. Henry came out of the barn, wiping his hands on his work pants, and she saw his posture stiffen as he recognized the deputy. Margaret's hand went instinctively to her swollen belly. This was it. Somehow they had found her. She was going to be arrested, dragged back to Philadelphia, hanged for murder. Her baby would be born in prison if she lived long enough to give birth at all. She felt dizzy with fear but forced herself to stand, to face whatever was coming with as much dignity as she could muster. She met Henry at the door and he took her hand, squeezing tightly. "Whatever this is, we face it together," he murmured. The three men approached and the one in the suit spoke first. "Are you Henry Lancaster?" "I am. What is this about?" "I am attorney Richard Morrison from Philadelphia. This is Marshal Davis. We have been searching for a woman named Margaret Vaughn, who is wanted for questioning in the death of Lawrence Vaughn 6 months ago. We have reason to believe she may be in this area." Margaret's legs nearly gave out, but Henry's grip on her hand kept her upright. "I am afraid I do not know anyone by that name," Henry said calmly. "This is your wife?" Morrison asked, looking at Margaret. "Yes, this is Margaret Lancaster. We married last August." Morrison studied Margaret's face, then her pregnant belly, and something like sympathy flickered in his eyes. "Mrs. Lancaster, I apologize for the intrusion, but I must ask. Were you previously known as Margaret Vaughn?" She looked at Henry, saw the encouragement in his eyes, and made a decision. She was done running, done hiding. If they were going to take her, she would at least tell the truth first. "I was. Lawrence Vaughn was my stepfather. I killed him in self-defense when he attacked me in my bedroom. I know how it looks. I know you probably think I am lying, but it is the truth. He had been abusing me for years, and that night I finally fought back." Morrison held up a hand. "Mrs. Lancaster, please let me finish. I am not here to arrest you. I am here to inform you that the charges against you have been dropped." Margaret blinked, certain she had misheard. "What? Your mother came to see me 3 weeks ago." She finally admitted the truth about her husband's behavior, about the abuse you suffered. She found his diaries after you left, filled with disturbing accounts of his obsession with you. She brought them to the police, along with testimony from neighbors and servants who had witnessed his violent behavior. The case has been reviewed, and the district attorney has determined that you acted in self-defense. There is no warrant for your arrest. You are free." The words did not seem real. Margaret swayed on her feet and Henry caught her, guiding her to the porch steps to sit down. "I do not understand. My mother, she believed me." Morrison sat beside her, his expression gentle. "She always believed you, Mrs. Lancaster. But she was afraid, both of her husband while he lived and of what would happen to you after he died. It took her some time to find the courage to come forward, but she did. She wanted me to tell you that she is sorry and that she hopes someday you might forgive her." Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "She does not need my forgiveness. I just wish I had known. I have been so afraid for so long. You are safe now. I have a document here, signed by the district attorney, officially clearing you of any wrongdoing in Lawrence Vaughn's death. You are free to return to Philadelphia if you wish, or to remain here in Missouri. The choice is yours." Henry's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close. "She is staying here," he said firmly. "This is her home." "I am staying," Margaret confirmed, looking up at her husband with love shining in her eyes. "My life is here now." Morrison nodded, seeming satisfied. He produced the document from his satchel and handed it to her. "Then I believe my business here is concluded. Congratulations on your marriage, Mrs. Lancaster, and on the coming baby. I hope you will be very happy." After the men had ridden away, Margaret sat on the porch steps holding the document and crying so hard she could barely breathe. Henry held her through it all, murmuring reassurances and pressing kisses to her hair. "It is over," he kept saying. "You are free, you are safe, it is all over." When she finally calmed enough to speak, she looked up at him with wonder in her eyes. "I cannot believe it. I truly cannot believe it." "Believe it. You can put this behind you now, move forward without fear." He placed a hand on her belly, feeling the baby move beneath his palm. "We can build our life together, raise our children, grow old on this ranch, all of it without shadows hanging over us." "Our children," she repeated, smiling through her tears. "I like the sound of that. I was hoping for at least 3 or 4 if you are agreeable." She laughed, the sound bright and free. "Let us see how the first one goes before we start planning an entire brood." That night, they made love slowly and carefully, honoring Margaret's pregnant state, and she felt more connected to Henry than ever before. All the barriers between them were finally gone. No more secrets, no more lies, just 2 people who loved each other building a future together. In late March, when the prairie grass was starting to turn green again and the wildflowers were beginning to bloom, Margaret went into labor. Henry was beside himself with worry, remembering what had happened to Caroline, but Dr. Brennan was calm and confident. "She is healthy and strong, Henry. Stop pacing and let me do my job." The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 14 hours, but when Margaret finally delivered a healthy baby boy with a strong cry and a shock of dark hair, Henry wept with relief and joy. He held his son carefully, marveling at the tiny fingers and perfect little face, then placed the baby in Margaret's arms. "He is beautiful," Margaret whispered, exhausted but glowing. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking William, after my father, William Henry Lancaster." "William is perfect." They took turns holding the baby through that first night, neither of them able to sleep, too captivated by this new life they had created. Mrs. Chen arrived in the morning to coo over the infant and help with the practical matters of new parenthood. The ranch hands all found excuses to come by the house to catch a glimpse of the new arrival, bringing gifts of hand-carved toys and knitted blankets. Margaret recovered well from the birth, and within a few weeks, she was back to her normal activities, though she now had a baby to care for as well. William was a good baby, calm and content, unless he was hungry or needed changing. Henry was a devoted father, rising with Margaret for the nighttime feedings and spending every free moment with his son. The months passed in a happy blur of sleepless nights and first smiles, and the simple joy of watching William grow. He was walking by 10 months, a sturdy little boy who followed his father around the ranch like a shadow. Margaret had never known such contentment, such bone-deep satisfaction with her life. On their second anniversary, Henry surprised her with a trip to St. Joseph for dinner and the theater. Mrs. Chen agreed to watch William for the evening, and Margaret dressed in her finest gown, grateful that her figure had returned to normal after the pregnancy. They dined at the hotel, reminiscing about their first awkward meals together, how far they had come since then. "I never thought I could be this happy," Margaret admitted as they walked along the riverfront after dinner. "2 years ago, I was running for my life, terrified and alone. Now I have a husband I love, a beautiful son, a home. Sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe it is real." "It is real," Henry assured her, pulling her close. "And it is only going to get better. I have a feeling we are just getting started." "Does that mean you still want 3 or 4 children?" she teased. "At least. William needs brothers and sisters to keep him company." "Well, then you will be pleased to know that we are already working on number 2. Henry stopped walking, staring at her. "You are pregnant again?" "I am. Only about 2 months along, but yes, another baby will arrive around next February." His whoop of joy echoed across the river, startling a flock of birds from the trees. He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. "How did I get so lucky?" he asked, setting her down and framing her face with his hands. "How did I get you?" "You wrote a good advertisement," she said, grinning. "And you were kind enough to believe in second chances. Third chances, fourth chances, as many as it takes. I love you, Margaret Lancaster." "I love you too, Henry Lancaster, more than I ever thought possible." They returned home that night to find William asleep in his cradle and Mrs. Chen dozing in the rocking chair. Henry carried his son up to the nursery while Margaret walked Mrs. Chen to her wagon. Alone in their bedroom later, they held each other close, talking about names for the new baby and plans for expanding the house to accommodate their growing family. The second pregnancy was easier than the first, and in February, as predicted, Margaret delivered a healthy baby girl they named Caroline Rose, honoring Henry's first wife while giving the baby her own identity. William was fascinated by his new sister, wanting to help with everything from diaper changes to feeding times. Henry was just as devoted as he had been with William, and Margaret marveled at how naturally fatherhood suited him. Life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. The days were busy and sometimes chaotic, but Margaret thrived on the activity, on the sense of purpose that came from caring for her family. The ranch continued to prosper, and Henry hired additional ranch hands to help manage the growing herd. They became known in St. Joseph as a model family, respected and well-liked by all who knew them. When William was 4 and Caroline 2, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. This time it was twins, 2 boys they named James and Thomas. The house was filled with noise and laughter, and the constant motion of small children. Margaret sometimes felt overwhelmed by the demands of 4 children under 5. But Henry was a true partner in parenting, always willing to change diapers or rock a crying baby or play with the older children when he came in from the fields. The years passed quickly, marked by milestones and celebrations. William started school in town, bringing home lessons to share with his siblings. Caroline learned to ride her own pony before she was 5, fearless in a way that terrified and delighted her parents. The twins were inseparable, always getting into mischief together and driving their older siblings crazy with their antics. On their 10th anniversary, Henry and Margaret took a rare trip alone to Kansas City, leaving the children in Mrs. Chen's capable care. They stayed in a fine hotel, attended the theater and concerts, and spent their days simply enjoying each other's company without the constant demands of parenthood. 10 years, Margaret said as they sat in a restaurant overlooking the city. Can you believe it has been 10 years? Best 10 years of my life, Henry said, raising his glass in a toast. Here is to at least 50 more. Are you sure you can handle 50 more years with me? I am not always the easiest person to live with. You are exactly the person I want to spend my life with. Easy or difficult, good days and bad, I would not trade a single moment. They returned home to find the house in chaos, as expected with 4 children and even patient Mrs. Chen looking frazzled. But the children mobbed them with hugs and kisses, and Margaret felt her heart swell with love for her noisy, messy, absolutely perfect family. In the years that followed, they had one more child, a daughter they named Alina, who completed their family. 5 children kept them busy, but Margaret had never been happier. The past that had once haunted her felt like a lifetime ago, something that had happened to a different person. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled Philadelphia with blood on her hands. She was Margaret Lancaster, rancher's wife and mother, beloved member of the community, woman who had built a good life from the ashes of tragedy. When William turned 18 and decided to stay on the ranch to work alongside his father, Margaret cried happy tears. The legacy they had built would continue, passed down to the next generation. Caroline married a lawyer from St. Joseph and gave them their first grandchild. The twins went off to university, both wanting to study engineering, and Alina was still at home, a bright 15-year-old with dreams of becoming a teacher. On a warm evening in late summer, Margaret and Henry sat on their porch as they had done countless times over the years, watching the sun set over the prairie. They were older now, gray in their hair and lines on their faces, but they still held hands like newlyweds. "Did I ever tell you," Margaret said quietly, "how grateful I am that you answered that door the day I arrived?" "Did I ever tell you," Henry countered, "how grateful I am that you answered my advertisement?" She smiled. "We have told each other quite a few times, I think." "It never gets old hearing it." He squeezed her hand. "Do you ever think about what you told me that night after the dance, about your past?" "Sometimes. But mostly I think about how you responded, how you told me the past stays buried and our future starts now. That changed everything for me. That let me finally stop running and start living. I am glad. You deserve to be happy, Margaret. You deserve to be loved." We both did. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. Inside the house, they could hear Alina practicing piano and William discussing something with his young wife. Grandchildren would be running through these halls soon, keeping the house full of life and laughter. Margaret thought about the girl she had been, terrified and alone on that stagecoach rolling into St. Joseph. She had been so certain her life was over, that she would never know peace or happiness again. But she had been wrong. Life had given her a second chance in the form of a kind cowboy who saw past her mistakes to the woman she could become. The past had stayed buried, just as Henry had promised. And their future, the one that had started on that dusty street corner 27 years ago, had been everything she never dared to hope for and more. It had been filled with love and laughter, children and grandchildren, hard work and simple pleasures. It had been, in every way that mattered, a life worth living. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear, Henry stood and offered Margaret his hand. "Ready for bed, Mrs. Lancaster." She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, her joints creaking a bit with age but her spirit still young. "Ready, Mr. Lancaster." They walked into the house together, closing the door on another perfect day, already looking forward to the next one and all the days that would follow. The past was behind them, buried deep where it could no longer hurt them. The future stretched out ahead, bright with promise and possibility. And the present, this precious now, was everything they had ever needed it to be. In the end, that was all anyone could ask for. A chance to start over, to build something beautiful from broken pieces, to find love in unexpected places. Margaret had gotten that chance, and she had made the most of it, creating a legacy that would outlive her and Henry both. Their children and grandchildren would carry forward the lessons they had learned, the values they had instilled, the love they had shared so generously. The house was quiet now, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and the soft murmur of voices as family members settled in for the night. Margaret climbed the stairs to the bedroom she had shared with Henry for nearly 3 decades, the room where their children had been conceived, where they had comforted each other through sorrows and celebrated joys. Henry was already in bed when she finished her nightly routine, and she slipped in beside him, curling into his familiar warmth. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," he replied, his arm coming around her automatically. "Always have, always will." She drifted off to sleep feeling safe and cherished, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together as they had faced everything else. The secret she had once carried like a weight around her neck was no longer hers to bear alone. She had shared it with the man she loved, and he had helped her transform it from a burden into just another part of her story, not the defining chapter, but merely a preface to the real tale of her life. The story of Margaret Lancaster was one of redemption and resilience, of finding light in the darkest places and building joy from pain. It was a story about second chances and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Most of all, it was a story about home, about finally finding the place where she belonged and the person who made that place complete. Years later, when Margaret's grandchildren asked her to tell them about how she and Grandpa had met, she would smile and share the sanitized version, about answering an advertisement and traveling west to marry a cowboy she had never met. She would tell them about their first awkward dinner, their wedding day, the early days of learning to be partners. She would leave out the darker parts, the secrets and fear, because those were not the parts that mattered anymore. What mattered was the love story that had grown from unlikely beginnings, the family that had been built on a foundation of trust and forgiveness, the life that had been carved out of the wild Missouri prairie through hard work and determination. That was the legacy she wanted to pass down, the lesson that no matter where you came from or what you had done, you could always start over if you had courage and someone who believed in you. The sun rose each morning over the Lancaster ranch, casting golden light across the fields and pastures, warming the house where 3 generations now gathered. The past stayed buried beneath the prairie grass, while the future continued to unfold in the laughter of children and the plans of young people eager to make their mark on the world. And in the center of it all was the love story that had started it all, the unlikely romance between a mail-order bride with a secret and the cowboy who told her the past could stay buried and gave her the freedom to embrace a future she had never dared to dream possible.